The first thing Marcus Chen noticed when he stepped off the transport ship was how everyone stared at him like he was. Already dead, he had expected curiosity and maybe some excitement, but the aliens watching him walk through the arrival terminal of the Galactic Academy looked at him with something closer to pity and fear mixed together in a way that made his skin crawl. Marcus was 24 years old, and he had worked his entire life for this moment. He had studied alien languages for 6 years and passed 17 different examinations and survived a 2-month journey through deep space just to be here. He was one of only 3 humans ever accepted into the most prestigious science academy in the known galaxy. And these aliens looked at him like he was a ghost walking among the living. The station world of Velmari Prime hung in the darkness of space like a jewel made of light and metal. It was home to over 40 million beings from 300 different species, and it contained the greatest collection of knowledge in galactic history. The Academy itself was a massive structure that floated at the center of the station, and it shimmered with energy fields that protected it from the vacuum outside. Marcus walked through corridors made of materials he could not name and past classrooms where students learned secrets of the universe that humans had never imagined. He should have felt amazed and grateful and excited, but all he could feel was the weight of those staring eyes. His assigned dormitory was in the carbon-based life form section, and his room was small but comfortable. It had a bed designed for human proportions, and a window that looked out at the stars, and a small desk where he could study. The academy had clearly prepared for his arrival, but something felt wrong as a chime sounded at his door, and Marcus opened it to find 3 aliens standing in the hallway. First was a being made entirely of living crystal. Her body was translucent and pale blue, and light moved through her like water through glass. She stood almost 2 meters tall, and her face had features that were almost human, but sharper and more angular. Her name was Velmari, and she was a Serati from a world of crystal caves and singing mountains. The second was an insectoid creature with 4 arms and 2 legs and a head covered in compound eyes that reflected everything around them like tiny mirrors. His exoskeleton was dark green, and his mandibles clicked softly when he moved. His name was Crix, and he was a Velmari from a jungle world where his species had evolved to be perfect survivors. The third was something Marcus had never seen before. She was gelatinous and translucent, and her body shifted and flowed like a living wave contained in a vaguely humanoid shape. She had no face that Marcus could recognize, but somehow he knew she was looking at him. Her name was Yenna, and she was an Oorans from an ocean world where her species had never known solid ground. "We are assigned study group," Velmari said, and her voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "We wanted to welcome you, and also to ask you something important." Marcus nodded and tried to smile in a friendly way. "Please come in." The 3 aliens entered his room, and they moved carefully around him like he was made of something fragile and precious. They stood in a small circle, and Marcus noticed that none of them would meet his eyes directly. "We have studied human biology," Crix said, and his mandibles clicked with each word. "We know about your species, and we are concerned about your participation in the field study next week." "What field study?" Marcus asked. "Professor Morvaxis is taking our class." "To Tazara 7," Yenna said, and her voice bubbled up from somewhere inside her shifting body. "It is a jungle moon with dangerous terrain and hostile wildlife. We will be collecting specimens for our xenobiology research." "That sounds exciting," Marcus said, and he meant it. He had always loved fieldwork, and the chance to explore an alien jungle was exactly why he had come to this academy. Velmari made a sound that might have been a sigh, and her crystal body vibrated with emotion. "That is what concerns us. Human, you do not regenerate like Yenna does. You cannot mold damaged tissue like Crix can. You do not have a distributed consciousness like my people do. If you are injured, you will simply stay injured." Marcus blinked at her in confusion. So what? Crix repeated. and his compound eyes widened in what looked like shock. Human, if you fall and break a bone, it will take months to heal. If you are cut, you will bleed, and that blood will not return to your body. If you are poisoned, your system cannot simply reject the toxins. You are fragile in ways that most species in this galaxy cannot comprehend. Marcus was starting to understand why everyone had been staring at him. The aliens did not see him as a fellow student or a curious visitor. They saw him as something tragic and doomed, a creature so poorly designed by evolution that it was a miracle his species had survived at all. "We do not want you to die," Yenna said softly, and her body pulsed with genuine concern. "We have lost exchange students before, and it is always painful. The Mallory who came 3 cycles ago did not survive their first field study, and the memory still haunts this academy." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. It was not fear or anger, but something closer to determination. He had faced doubt and dismissal his entire life. He had been told he was not smart enough, and not strong enough, and not good enough to achieve his dreams. And every single time he had proven them wrong. "I appreciate your concern," Marcus said, and his voice was calm and steady. "But I think you might be misunderstanding something about humans." "What do you mean?" Velmari asked. Marcus smiled, and this time it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator who had just been underestimated. "You see us as fragile because we cannot regenerate, and we cannot molt, and we cannot distribute our consciousness across multiple bodies. But where I come from, we have a different word for creatures like us." "What word?" Crix asked survivors, Marcus said, and the word hung in the air like a promise and a warning. "Humans do not bounce back from injury. We do not heal instantly. We do not have backup bodies or spare parts. We get hurt, and we stay hurt, and we feel every moment of pain." He paused and looked at each of his new classmates in turn. "And then we get up and keep going anyway." 3 aliens stared at him in silence, and Marcus could see that they did not understand what he was telling them. They would learn soon enough. On Tesar 7, they would all learn what it truly meant to be human, and nothing would ever be the same again. The shuttle descended through clouds of green and gold, and the jungle moon of Tesar 7 rose up to meet them like a hungry beast waiting for its prey. Marcus pressed his face against the viewport and watched the alien forest grow larger and more detailed with every passing second. The trees were massive things with trunks as wide as buildings and leaves that glowed with soft, bioluminescent light. The undergrowth was thick and tangled, and strange creatures moved through the shadows, like ghosts made of fur and scales and things that had no name in any human language. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Marcus had ever seen. Professor Morvaxis stood at the front of the shuttle and addressed the class with all 6 of his limbs gesturing in complex patterns that emphasized his words. He was a Kellery from a world of vast libraries and ancient knowledge, and his body was covered in gray scales that shifted color when he spoke. "Students, today you will collect specimens from the forest floor. You will work in your assigned groups, and you will not venture more than 500 meters from the landing site. Is this understood?" The class responded with various sounds of agreement, and Marcus noticed that several students were looking at him with that same mixture of pity and fear that he had grown so tired of seeing. Professor Morvaxis continued his briefing. "The wildlife on Tesar 7 is mostly harmless, but there are predators in the deeper forest. Stay alert and stay together. If anyone encounters danger, activate your emergency beacon immediately." Marcus checked his equipment one final time. He had a specimen collection kit and a scanner and a first aid kit that the Academy had insisted he carry at all times. He also had a knife strapped to his belt because humans had learned long ago that sharp metal could solve many problems that technology could not. Shuttle touched down in a clearing, and the door slid open, and the smell of the alien jungle rushed in like a wave. It was rich and complex and full of scents that Marcus could not identify. It smelled like life and death and everything in between. His Study group gathered around him, and Velmari, Crix, and Yenna all wore expressions of intense concern. "We will stay close to you," Velmari said, and her crystal body hummed with protective energy. "If anything happens, we will carry you back to the shuttle. I can extend my body to create a cushion beneath you if you fall," Yenna added, and her gelatinous form rippled with readiness. Marcus felt a strange mix of gratitude and frustration. He appreciated their concern, but he also wanted to prove that he was not the fragile creature they believed him to be. "Thank you," he said, "but I will be fine. Humans are tougher than we look." Crix made a clicking sound that might have been doubt, but he said nothing. The group moved into the forest, and Marcus felt the jungle close around them like a living thing. The light filtered through the massive leaves above and created patterns of shadow and glow that seemed to shift and dance with every step. The ground was soft and covered in moss that glowed faintly purple, and strange fungi grew in clusters that pulsed with inner light. It was like walking through a dream that could not decide if it wanted to be beautiful or dangerous. Marcus spotted a cluster of bioluminescent mushrooms growing on a fallen log, and he moved toward them with his scanner ready. "These are exactly what Professor Marvaxis wanted," he said, and his voice was excited. "We should collect samples." He stepped onto the log to get a better angle, and for a moment, everything was perfect. The mushrooms glowed beneath his scanner, and the data flowed into his collection kit, and he felt like a real xenobiologist doing real work on an alien world. Then his foot slipped on the moss-covered bark. Marcus felt himself falling, and time seemed to slow down as his body tumbled off the log and rolled down a small ravine that he had not noticed. He grabbed at roots and rocks, but everything was slick with moisture and nothing would hold. He hit the bottom of the ravine hard and felt something sharp slice across his forearm. Pain exploded through his arm like fire, and Marcus looked down to see blood flowing from a deep gash that ran from his elbow to his wrist. The wound was ugly and ragged, and the blood was bright red against his pale skin. He heard screaming from above. Marcus looked up and saw his 3 classmates standing at the edge of the ravine, and all of them were frozen in absolute horror. Velmari was making a high-pitched sound that seemed to shake the very air around her, and her crystal body was vibrating so intensely that Marcus worried she might shatter. Crix was clicking his mandibles in rapid panic, and his compound eyes were wide with what could only be terror. Yenna had gone completely still, and her gelatinous body had turned a sickly gray color. "He is bleeding," Crix shouted, and his voice cracked with fear. "The human is bleeding. We need emergency evacuation." Velmari cried out, and she fumbled for her beacon with trembling crystalline hands. "He is dying. We are watching him die." Marcus sat at the bottom of the ravine with blood running down his arm and pooling on the ground beside him, and he watched his classmates fall apart with something close to confusion. He looked at his wound again, just to make sure he was not missing something. It was a bad cut for sure, maybe 15 centimeters long, and deep enough that he could see the white of tissue beneath the skin. It hurt quite a lot, and it was bleeding freely, and it would definitely need stitches, but dying seemed like a strong word for it. Etienne had started making a sound that Marcus realized was crying. Even though she had no eyes to produce tears, "We studied human biology," she wailed. "They cannot regenerate. Blood loss is fatal within minutes. He has minutes to live, and we cannot save him." Marcus opened his mouth to say something reassuring, but before he could speak, Professor Marvaxis appeared at the edge of the ravine. His 6 limbs were spread wide for balance, and his gray scales had turned a deep shade of purple that Marcus did not recognize. "Everyone stay calm," the professor commanded, and his voice carried the weight of authority and something else that Marcus could not quite identify. "Experience, perhaps, Professor. He is dying," Velmari said, and her voice was breaking. "Do something." Marvaxis looked down at Marcus, and their eyes met across the distance. The professor studied the wound and studied the blood and studied the human sitting calmly in the dirt. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He smiled. "No, he said, and his voice was almost gentle. "He's not dying." Pointed one of his limbs at Marcus' watch, and Marcus finally understood what he needed to do. Marcus pulled himself up from the ground and brushed the dirt off his pants with his uninjured hand. He looked at the gash on his arm and sighed heavily. "Well, that is annoying," he said, and his voice carried no more emotion than if he had spilled coffee on his shirt. I really liked this jacket above him. At the edge of the ravine, his classmates had gone completely silent. Their panic had transformed into something else, entirely a kind of frozen disbelief that seemed to hold them in place. Like statues made of shock, Marcus reached for his first aid kit and pulled it open with practiced efficiency. He had done this before, more times than he could count, really. Humans were always getting hurt, and humans were always patching themselves back together. It was simply part of being alive. He pulled out a bottle of water and poured it over the wound to clean away the dirt and debris. The water ran red with blood and dripped onto the ground, and somewhere above him, Yenna made a sound, like she was going to be sick. "Does that not hurt?" Crix asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. Marcus shrugged. "It hurts quite a lot, actually, but pain is just information. It tells me something is wrong. It does not mean I have to stop functioning." He pulled out a small canister of coagulant spray and applied it to the wound. The bleeding slowed almost immediately as the chemical foam sealed the smaller blood vessels. The larger ones would need more attention, but at least he was not going to bleed out in the next few minutes. Velmari was staring at him with an expression that might have been horror or might have been fascination, or might have been both at the same time. "You are sealing your own wound," she said, and her crystalline voice trembled with disbelief. "Yes," Marcus said calmly. "That is generally how this works." He reached into his kit again and pulled out a curved needle and a spool of medical thread. His classmates made various sounds of confusion and alarm when they saw what he was holding. "What is that?" Yenna asked. Marcus threaded the needle with the ease of long practice. "This is how humans close wounds when we do not have access to proper medical facilities. I'm going to sew my skin back together." There was a long moment of absolute silence. Then Crix spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. "You are going to push a sharp piece of metal through your own flesh repeatedly while you are fully conscious and aware of every sensation." "Yes," Marcus said, and he positioned the needle at the edge of his wound. "It is not my favorite activity, but it gets the job done." He pushed the needle through his skin and felt the familiar sharp sting of metal piercing tissue. He winced slightly, but his hands remained steady as he pulled the thread through and created the first stitch above him. Velmari sat down heavily on the ground. Her crystal body was making sounds that Marcus had never heard before, a kind of harmonic vibration that seemed to express emotions too complex for words. "You are in pain," she said, and it was not a question. "Moderate pain." "Yes," Marcus agreed as he made his second stitch. "The local nerves are quite upset with me right now, but I have had worse," Crix repeated, and his mandibles were clicking so fast that the sound blurred together. What could possibly be worse than this? Marcus thought about it for a moment while he continued stitching. "Well, when I was 12, I broke my leg falling out of a tree. That hurt significantly. More than this, the bone came through the skin, and I had to wait 3 hours for help to arrive." His classmates made sounds of absolute horror. "When I was 19, I got second-degree burns on my hand from a cooking accident," Marcus continued conversationally. "That was unpleasant. The skin blistered and peeled off, and it took about 2 weeks to heal properly." He made another stitch and then another. "Oh, and when I was 7, I had an infection in my ear that felt like someone was stabbing the inside of my head with a hot knife. That one was memorable." He finished the last stitch and tied off the thread and examined his work with a critical eye. The stitches were not beautiful, but they were functional. The wound was closed and the bleeding had stopped. And in a week or 2, he would have a new scar to add to his collection. "There," he said with satisfaction, "that should hold until we get back to the station." Now where were we with those mushrooms? Professor Morvaxis had climbed down into the ravine at some point during the procedure, and he was watching Marcus with an expression that the human could not quite read. The Kilori had seen many things in his long life, but watching a human casually sew himself back together while discussing fungal biology was clearly a new experience. "You have done this before," the professor said, and it was not a question. Many times Marcus replied as he repacked his first aid kit. "Humans get hurt constantly. Our world is full of sharp edges and hard surfaces, and things that want to eat us. We learned very early that if we stopped every time we felt pain, we would never get anything done." Stood up and tested his arm. The stitches pulled slightly, but they held. The pain was still there, but it had faded to a dull throb that he could easily ignore. "Shall we continue collecting specimens?" Marcus asked. He looked up at his classmates, who were still staring at him like he had just performed some kind of dark miracle. "We are running out of daylight," Velmari was the first to find her voice. "You just sewed your own flesh together without any pain suppression or sedation or assistance. And now you want to continue working." "Yes," Marcus said simply. "Is that unusual?" The three aliens looked at each other, and something passed between them. A shared realization that everything they thought they knew about humans was fundamentally incomplete. Tekrix finally spoke, and his voice had changed. There was something new in it, something that sounded almost like respect human. He said slowly, "I do not think unusual is a strong enough word for what you just did." Marcus smiled and climbed out of the ravine with only a slight grunt of effort. He picked up his specimen scanner and walked back toward the fallen log where the bioluminescent mushrooms were still glowing softly in the dim light. "Coming," he called over his shoulder. His classmates followed him in silence, but they no longer looked at him with pity now. They looked at him with something much closer to fear, and Marcus pretended not to notice because there was still science to be done and a little blood loss was no reason to waste a perfectly good research opportunity. The mushrooms were even more beautiful up close, and Marcus collected his samples with steady hands that showed no sign of trembling behind him. Professor Morvaxis watched and said nothing, and his scales had turned a color that none of his students had ever seen before. It was the color of witnessing something impossible. It was the color of understanding that the galaxy had made a terrible mistake in its assessment of humanity. The shuttle ride back to Valoros Prime was the quietest journey Marcus had ever experienced. 47 students sat in absolute silence, and every single one of them was staring at him. The wound on his arm was bandaged, now covered by a proper medical dressing that Professor Morvaxis had applied after they returned from the forest. But everyone had seen what happened in that ravine. Everyone had watched the human push a needle through his own flesh and sew himself back together like it was nothing more than mending a torn shirt. Marcus tried to focus on his specimen notes, but the weight of all those eyes made concentration impossible. Finally, he looked up and spread his hands in a gesture of confusion. "Why is everyone staring at me?" he asked. "Is there something on my face?" Velmari made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cry of disbelief. "You do not understand. Do you understand what?" Marcus asked. "What you did back there," Crick said, and his voice was hushed like he was speaking about something sacred or forbidden. "What you showed us about your species. I cleaned and closed a wound," Marcus said slowly. "That is basic first aid. Every human child learns how to do this." Iena floated closer to him, and her gelatinous body had returned to its normal color, but her movements were hesitant and careful. "Marcus, we have studied human biology extensively. We know your species cannot regenerate damaged tissue. We know your blood does not replenish itself quickly. We know that pain signals in your nervous system are acute and overwhelming." She paused, and her whole body trembled. "We believed these things made you fragile." She continued, "We believed you were a species one step away from extinction at all times. We believed that coming to this academy was an act of desperate courage, driven by beings too foolish to understand their own limitations." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. That mixture of frustration and determination that had driven him his entire life. The same feeling he had experienced when his classmates first told him they were worried about his survival. And what do you believe now? He asked quickly. Velmari answered for all of them. We do not know what to believe anymore. You experienced significant trauma and blood loss and intense pain, and your response was mild annoyance at the damage to your clothing. How is that possible? How can any creature function under those conditions? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He thought about how to explain something that was so fundamental to human existence that he had never questioned it before. Let me tell you about Earth, he said finally. The students leaned in closer, and even Professor Morvaxis turned to listen. My planet is a death world, Marcus said, and he was not exaggerating or being dramatic. He was simply stating facts. Our oceans are filled with creatures that can kill us with a single bite or sting. Our land has predators that hunt us and parasites that consume us from within. Our weather systems produce storms that flatten cities, and our geology produces earthquakes that swallow entire populations. He held up his bandaged arm. This wound would have killed an ancestor of mine 50,000 years ago. There was no medicine and no stitches and no antibiotics. An infection would have set in and they would have died in agony. He lowered his arm. But they did not stop going out into the world. They did not hide in caves and wait for safety that would never come. They learned, they adapted. They figured out which plants could fight infection and which techniques could close wounds, and they passed that knowledge down through generations. Marcus looked around at his classmates and saw that he had their complete attention. Humans break bones, Marcus continued, and those bones hurt every single day while they heal, which takes weeks or months. But we set them in place and wrap them in rigid materials, and we keep walking, we keep working, we keep surviving because the alternative is unacceptable. He pulled up his sleeve on his uninjured arm and showed them a series of faded scars that crossed his skin like a map of past battles. This one is from when I was 8 and fell off my bicycle, Marcus said, pointing to a long white line on his forearm. I needed 12 stitches. This one is from when I was 15 and cut myself on broken glass. 6 stitches. And this one is from a surgery I had when I was 20. They opened my abdomen to remove a damaged organ. Aliens stared at the scars with expressions of horrified fascination. You carry the marks of past injuries permanently, Crick said, and his voice was barely audible. They never fully disappear, no, Marcus agreed. They become part of us, reminders of what we survived. Every human you will ever meet carries scars, some visible and some hidden. But we all have them. He thought about the history of his species, the wars and plagues and famines, the ice ages that nearly wiped them out, the predators that hunted them before they became the hunters, the countless generations who suffered and struggled and died so that their descendants might have a chance. Humans do not heal, Marcus said softly. Not really, not the way your species do. We break and we bleed and we scar and we suffer and we keep going anyway. Because somewhere in our evolutionary history, we learned that stopping means dying. He met the eyes of every student in that shuttle. One by one, pain is not our enemy. He said, pain is our teacher. It tells us what hurts so we can avoid it in the future. It tells us what works and what does not. It makes us smarter and stronger and more careful. And when we cannot avoid it, we endure it because we have no other choice. Professor Morvaxis spoke. For the first time since leaving the planet's surface, your species developed medicine, he said, and his voice carried a weight of new understanding. Not because you could heal, but because you could. Not exactly, Marcus said. We invented surgery because we had to. We created antibiotics because infections were killing us. We developed prosthetics because losing a limb did not mean we were willing to stop living. He smiled, and it was not the smile of someone who was fragile or pitiful. It was the smile of someone who had looked death in the face countless times and refused to blink. We are not survivors despite our limitations, he said. We are survivors because of them. Every weakness forced us to become stronger. Every vulnerability pushed us to become smarter. Every moment of pain taught us something new. Shao was completely silent then. Yenna spoke, and her voice was filled with something that sounded like awe. You evolved on a world that was trying to kill you, she said, and instead of dying, you learned to kill it back. Marcus considered this for a moment, then shook his head. No, he said. Not kill, overcome. We did not destroy our predators. We outlasted them. We did not conquer disease. We developed treatments that let us survive. We did not defeat death. We simply refused to accept it as an ending. He looked out the viewport at the stars streaming past. Humans are fragile, he admitted. That part is true. We break easily and heal slowly and carry our wounds forever. But fragility is not the same as weakness. He turned back to face his classmates. Sometimes the most dangerous creature in the room is the one that knows exactly how much it can lose and chooses to fight anyway. Shuttle continued through the darkness of space. And somewhere in the back of the cabin, Professor Morvaxis quietly began composing a message to the Galactic Council. The universe needed to know what humanity really was: not a fragile species stumbling toward extinction, but something far more terrifying: persistence. Given flesh, endurance made manifest, a species that had looked into the abyss of their own mortality and smiled back. Word spread through the Galactic Academy like fire through dry grass. Within 3 days, every student on Valoros Prime had heard the story of the human who sewed his own flesh back together in a jungle ravine. Within a week, the story had reached the faculty of 100 different departments. Within a month, it had traveled beyond the academy and into the wider galaxy. And with the story came questions. Millions of beings across thousands of worlds began researching human history for the first time. They accessed the archives that Earth had shared when humanity joined the galactic community, and they read about the species that called itself human. What they found changed everything. The Sorati Council learned about human warfare, the endless cycles of conflict that had defined human civilization from its earliest days. They read about battles fought with sticks and stones and metal and fire, and weapons that could split atoms and destroy cities in a single flash. They learned that humans had killed each other by the billions and yet kept multiplying and spreading and growing stronger. The Sorati were horrified. Their species had nearly gone extinct from a single war that lasted 3 years. Humans had fought for millennia and called it normal. The Velmari Collective learned about human medicine. They studied the history of surgery and discovered that humans had been cutting into their own bodies for thousands of years long. Before they had any way to numb the pain, they read about battlefields where doctors amputated limbs with saws, while patients bit down on leather straps to keep from screaming. They learned about chemotherapy and radiation treatment, and the 100 ways humans poison themselves to kill diseases that would otherwise kill them. First, the Velmari could not process this information. Their species healed through molting, and they had never conceived of beings who would willingly destroy parts of themselves to save the whole. The Oorans Federation learned about human endurance. They studied the records of humans walking for days on broken legs, crawling through deserts without water, surviving in conditions that should have killed them 100 times over. They learned about the human heart, which could keep beating through trauma and shock and blood loss that would have stopped any other organ. They learned about the human mind, which could override pain and fear and exhaustion through nothing but willpower. The Oorans had no words for what they were reading. Their species felt no pain and had no concept of endurance. They simply reformed when damaged. They could not understand what it meant to suffer and continue anyway. But it was the Galactic Council itself that had the strongest reaction. Counselor Threnix of the Security Division read Professor Morvaxis' report 3 times before she believed it was real. She was a Kalari, like the professor, and she had lived for 400 years and seen many things, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the truth about humanity. Humans had been classified as a Category 7 species when they first made contact. Fragile and vulnerable and in need of protection, the galaxy had looked at their soft bodies and weak healing and short lifespans and assumed they were barely surviving on the edge of extinction. The classification was wrong. Counselor Threnix stared at the data on her screen and felt something she had not experienced in centuries. Fear. She began composing a recommendation for reclassification. Meanwhile, on Valoro's prime, Marcus Chen had become the most famous human in the Academy. Students followed him through the corridors and whispered when he passed. Faculty members invited him to speak in their classes. Researchers requested interviews about human biology and psychology and history. He received messages from beings on distant worlds who wanted to know if the stories were true. Marcus found the attention overwhelming and strange. He had done nothing special. He had simply reacted to an injury the way any human would. He could not understand why everyone was treating him like he had performed some kind of miracle. It is because we thought we understood your species, Velmari explained. One evening, they were sitting in the Academy cafeteria, and Marcus was eating dinner while his classmates watched him with expressions of endless fascination. We thought humans were the weakest beings in the galaxy, creatures to be protected and pitied and helped. She paused, and her crystalline body hummed with emotion. We did not realize that weakness and strength are not opposites, she continued. Sometimes, the strongest creatures are the ones who know exactly how fragile they are and refuse to let it stop them. Marcus scratched absently at his healing wound. The stitches had come out 2 days ago, and the skin was still pink and tender, but it was closing nicely. In another week, it would be just another scar. Your people really never get hurt? He asked. Ed Cricks answered. We get damaged. Yes, but damage is different from injury. When I break a limb, I simply molt and grow a new one. When Yena is torn apart, she reforms within hours. When Velmari cracks, she can be repaired by skilled artisans. Clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. None of us have ever experienced what you call pain, he admitted. We know it exists as a concept, but we cannot truly understand it. We have never felt our bodies scream at us to stop and then chosen to continue. Anyway, Marcus nodded slowly. I think that might be the key to understanding humans, he said. We are not strong because we cannot be hurt. We are strong because we can be hurt, and we keep going. Anyway, Anna made a soft bubbling sound that Marcus had learned to interpret as agreement. That is what terrifies the galaxy about your species, she said. You are not immune to suffering. You are simply unimpressed by it. Marcus laughed at that. He had never thought of himself as unimpressed by suffering. He felt pain just like anyone else. He simply knew that pain was temporary and that giving up was permanent. The cafeteria door opened and Professor Morvaxis walked in. His scales were the deep purple color that Marcus had seen in the ravine, and his 6 limbs moved with unusual deliberation. He approached Marcus directly, and his eyes held something that looked almost like apology human. He said, I have just received word from the Galactic Council. They have reviewed my report, and they have made a decision regarding your species. Marcus felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. What decision, Professor? Morvaxis was quiet for a long moment. Humanity has been reclassified, he said finally. You are no longer Category 7. His scales shifted to an even darker shade of purple. You are now Category 2. The cafeteria went completely silent. Category 2 was reserved for apex predators, the most dangerous beings in the known galaxy, species that could not be threatened or intimidated or controlled. Marcus stared at the professor in shock. We did not do anything, he said. I just stitched up a cut. Professor Morvaxis shook his great head. No, he said. You showed us what humans truly are. Not fragile creatures who need protection, but persistent predators who cannot be stopped, who refuse to stay down, who treat mortal wounds as inconveniences. leaned closer, and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. The galaxy is afraid of you now, human. They have finally realized what Earth has always known. He straightened, and his scales flickered with colors that Marcus could not interpret. You are the species that looked at a universe full of death and danger and said yes. But watch this. Marcus sat in the silent cafeteria surrounded by aliens who now looked at him with something between terror and reverence. He thought about all the humans back on Earth who had no idea that their species had just been classified among the most dangerous beings in existence. They were just people, really just ordinary, fragile, stubborn, impossible people who got hurt and got back up and refused to stop no matter what the universe threw at them. And somehow that made them the scariest thing in the galaxy. Marcus smiled and finished his dinner and pretended not to notice. When the other students moved a little further away from his table, let them be afraid, he thought to himself. Humans had been underestimated for their entire existence. They had been dismissed by predators and parasites and plagues and the cruel indifference of a hostile universe, and they had survived every single time, not because they could not be hurt, but because they refused to stay broken. Galaxy finally understood what it meant to be human, and nothing would ever be the same again.